What's up guys, it's that time again. We've got a new update, and of course that means that there are new skills to test out, new augments to mess around with, and new lances to sink our teeth into. I'm sure we're all excited, so let's get right into it. We've got 3 totally new armor skills in this update, and a new rampage decoration. We've got Intrepid Heart, Embolden, Build Up Boost, and Bloody Heart. So, starting with Flaming Espinas's new skill, Intrepid Heart. In my opinion, this is the least interesting skill for Lance that has come out with the new update. But in reality, that tells you more about how cool the other skills are, rather than how bad this skill is. The way Intrepid Heart works is interesting. By attacking, you fill up a bar, just above your other bar, and once it's been filled, the next attack that you would get hit by, that would also normally knock you back, will do reduced damage and you won't be knocked back by it. At 2 levels of Intrepid Heart, it will also do a small explosion when you get hit, allowing you to do damage to the monster while it hits you. I can't see either armor pieces that have Intrepid Heart on being overly useful for the Lance. You could use Intrepid Heart with Hellfire Cloak to proc a bunch of explosions, and that could be a fun gimmick. But as you can see by all the straws that I'm grasping, I don't see any overt uses for the skill on the Lance. Speaking of Flaming Espinas's armor, it's alright. Razor Sharp isn't quite as useful as Master's Touch in the current meta, and the other skills that we get are Charge Master and Marathon Runner, neither of which are particularly ideal for Lance, but the chest is pretty decent for attack boost. Violet Mizutsune's skill, on the other hand, seems entirely made for Lance. Embolden increases your defensive capabilities, but at the cost of making monsters quicker to enrage. I say at the cost, but making monsters angry increases your uptime of Agitator, so really it's a win-win. Although it might not help overcome Agitator's issues regarding afflicted monsters. What Embolden actually does as a skill is really valuable for Lance users that like the guard skill. Embolden level 1, 2, and 3 is equivalent of 1, 3, and 5 levels of guard, and it also stacks with regular guard. So by combining guard, you can finally fulfill your dreams of becoming a rock. It also gives you an increase to your iframes, making hopping around more consistent, especially if you want to use Evade Lance. The real benefit, however, is that Embolden does both, and that makes hybriding Guard and Evade Lance together really effective. Or at least it would if the Embolden armor pieces didn't overlap with the armor pieces that you'd want to use for Evade Lance, like Adrenaline Rush. However, Mizu's armor set as a whole is surprisingly good. Speaking of Evade Lance, the waist piece giving you a point of Adrenaline Rush is quite nice, so mixing and matching armor sets correctly might make a hybrid set possible after all. The head, the chest, and the arms aren't particularly great for Lance, but they also have great slots, and the chest and arms also have the Embolden skill on. And if you're not planning on using Geismar legs for Dereliction, Violet Mizutsune's legs are really efficient for Lance. A 4 slot on top of 2 points of weakness exploit and 2 points of offensive guard is crazy. And speaking of crazy good, let's move on to the next major thing we got in the update. Risen Chameleos' new skill, Build Up Boost, is significantly harder to get as it requires an MR of 110 to unlock the monster. But as consequence, the skill is significantly stronger than the other two that we've talked about. It's got 3 levels, and it gives a 10, 15, and 20% boost to your raw damage whenever you're proccing status. So under normal assumptions, that makes this a skill that increases your damage by 3.3%, 5%, and 6.6%, which is pretty sizable. And if we can get an 100% proc rate by using status trigger, that increases the boost back to 10, 15, and 20%, which is crazy. But the real kicker is that it's a boost to effective raw. So it's multiplying your weapon and all your attack skills on your armor set, rather than just boosting displayed raw, which would multiply your weapon's attack before you add all of your other damage skills onto that number. It's a crazy skill, and it's making status look really strong in this update. Finally, there is also a new 2-slot rampage decoration that increases damage while you're affected by blood blight. After testing it, it's not overly strong. It's quite difficult to gauge its worth. In the best case scenario, it's a plus 30 to raw, but you have to ramp up to that, and by the time you get that much of an attack increase, the blight ends and it resets to 0. Not to mention that you have to go out of your way to get hit, which isn't ideal. Overall, I don't think it's worth using over the anti-species decorations, but I guess it's nice to have when dealing with afflicted spiders that don't have anti-species decorations. That's all the skills wrapped up, so I guess the next thing to have a look at is weapons. Looking at the new weapons that we've got for this update is a little bit painful. We've gotten 2 new fire weapons, or rather a fire weapon and a dual fire and poison weapon. So unfortunately, they're both competing for the same spot. And that means that Violet Mizutsune's lance isn't going to feature much in this video. It's good. It's really flexible, so it's got a niche. If you're building an armor set around loads of really expensive skills, you can use the Violet Mizutsune lance to avoid having to think about sharpness, and it's also got 3 2-slots, so it's got a lot of armor space for you to be flexible around. In terms of damage, however, Flaming Espinasse is a much stronger lance, and it actually competes with the current metal lances quite nicely. In terms of raw damage and fire element alone, it's not quite as strong as the other current metal lances, but the poison that the Flaming Espinasse lance helps push it over the edge in all the cases. As of writing and recording this, I haven't seen a data mine online that indicates the exact value of Espinasse's poison, but I've used the training dummy to calculate that it has around 25 poison, and yes, that makes it better at dishing out poison than Lucent Nogakuga's lance. Oof. Another benefit of Flaming Espinasse's poison is that it allows to benefit from build-up boost, which is something that other fire lances just cannot do. Speaking of build-up boost, it's given status a big push forward in viability, and that's been a blessing and a curse, because on one hand, poison is actually good now, but on the other hand, status is a massive pain in the ass to model, which in turn makes estimating it really iffy. Thankfully, I've done the hard work, so we're gonna get a full breakdown on status. But first, let's talk about weapon augments. So, Augments. We've been given new levels of augments. We've gained one extra slot to fit more augments in. But how do we know which augments to use? In terms of effectiveness, weapons with negative affinity, like Gyasmagorm, Diabolos, or the Basilgeuse Lances, will want affinity. So you'll want the 2 slot of attack and the 3 slot affinity. And then you'll just fill that extra slot with whatever you can. Weapons with a level 1 rampage slot, like the Furious Rajang Lance, the new Violet Mizutsune Lance, or the Malzeno Lance, will be able to get a rampage upgrade and a 2 slot this time around, and being able to fit the rampage anti-species decorations in is still the most efficient thing to do with your augments. For the rest of the weapons, it seems like going full in on attack is the most effective thing to do to increase a weapon's overall effectiveness. There are niche situations where dropping attack slots for element is the best thing to do, but it's the best thing to do by technicality. It's within a rounding error of difference. So it's simplest to just go for the full attack augments. And now that we've got that out of the way, we can move on to armor sets. So firstly, the tables have gotten an upgrade. One of the things that I wasn't happy with in the previous videos was that I was only comparing fire lances when looking at monsters weak to fire, and so on. We all know that Valstrax was pretty strong, and stronger than elemental weapons in certain cases. So why couldn't other lances be stronger in other elemental matchups? So now we're comparing every lance against every monster, and the results are surprising. Looking at the fire table, it's pretty normal. The new Espines lance is the strongest. This is largely in part because of its added poison, and if we take a look at the table, when we ignore the poison on the weapon, it's not quite as dominant. I also want to point out that the reason why Water Mizutsune wins once is because of how Baroth's state changes. You might see a few of these around. It's to help you make a better choice over what element to bring to the monster. So to spell out this specific case, Wet Mizu's lance is better to get rid of the mud, but once the mud is gone, fire is better. And it's here to let you decide if you want water or fire for Baroth. We'll quickly go over the rest of the charts because they're much more messy and they show us how badly we are in need of a decent water and a decent thunder lance. These armor sets haven't changed, so if you're interested in them, check out last update's meta video equivalent. But I wouldn't worry too much because in truth, these charts are only half of the view of what's going on in the meta. So let's talk status. Status has gotten a huge boost in the form of build-up boost, and poison specifically has gotten another strong bonus in the form of easy access to the 3rd level of Camellios Blessing. This has allowed the Remobra Lance, the Pukei Lance, and the Flaming Espines Lance to completely dominate the meta. There are a few bastions of element usage. Valstrax is still clinging on, so is Lunagoron. It's still useful thanks to the valiant effort of Great Rocky. And technically, Mizutsune's lance is best against Silverloss, but only when its head has been broken and it's in its Hellfire state. Unfortunately, Thunder is being completely eclipsed by the power of poison. However, we do have an interesting outlier, and that's Teostra's lance being the best against Nawa. The gap between the Remobra lance and the Pukei lance is incredibly small, so if you want to cut down on the lances that you make an augment, then I'd recommend making the remobra lance over the pukei lance. However, this assumes that you have enough 4 slots to fit the 2 handicraft plus decorations in. If you don't have that, then pukei lance will pull ahead because of sharpness. Talking about the armor sets themselves, we're using the previous meta set, but we're swapping out the Baroth arms for Chameleos arms. That's the basis of the set. Then we need to augment 5 useful skills onto the armor. The skills I've gotten are 3 points of offensive guard, 1 point of weakness exploit, and 1 point of critical boost. But as long as you're adding useful skills onto your armor, you should be able to fumble decorations around to make your own version of this. Now, we've also got another skill that we could throw into the mix. Status Trigger is now a damage skill, thanks to build-up boost, and with proper timing, this can be a devastating option. By swapping the Rathalos Waste to the Golden Rathian Waste, we can gain 1 level of Status Trigger at the cost of 2 critical eye. And as long as you have a high enough uptime of Status Trigger, which is about 50% uptime, then Status Trigger sets start to dominate over everything. However, if you're having a lower uptime than 50%, it's not worth using. And remember, you've only got 5 seconds of Status Trigger per dodge. So it's going to be really tight doing damage while keeping all your buffs active. An alternative to this is to drop the helmet to get 3 levels of Status Trigger for a 12-second window of guaranteed build-up boost procs. You're trading Bloodlust for the extra Status Trigger and for maxing out Foray. Foray is a sort of workable alternative to Bloodlust, so it evens out as long as you're using poison weapons. But if you're fighting monsters where you're not having them poisoned most of the fight, sharpness will end up being an issue. It's not as powerful on paper, but it gives you a better Status Trigger uptime, and if you can get 80% uptime with this build, then it becomes stronger than the other on-paper version, and so this set is the thing to run. We've gotten over the main hump of this video, so I now want to spend some time talking about the caveats of the data that I've given you. Status is a really complicated thing to test because monsters get resistant to the status as the hunt goes on. So one of the things I've had to do to calculate status is to estimate how long a hunt takes. What this means is that the longer hunts go on, the worse status is compared to element, as your status damage has to reach higher and higher thresholds to actually cause the ailment. So, if we assume you take 15 minutes to complete the hunt, then we're going to get some cases where Mizutsune starts to be better than the Poison Lances, and Lunagoron and Valstrax will both edge out Poison in more cases than before. If we then assume that you take 20 minutes to complete a hunt, that's when Kadachi starts to win out in a few matchups as well. It's a bit funny to think about, as the consensus online is that Poison is great if you suck at using a weapon, as Poison is still doing damage while you're not hitting the monster. But in actuality, it seems that status is more effective the shorter your hunts are. The other main caveat is that Poison, and status in general, aren't as strong if lots of people bring the same status in multiplayer. Because the monster can only be poisoned one at a time, the DPS of Poison is going to be split between all people that are dealing the poison. The other main caveat is that Poison, and status in general, aren't as strong if lots of people bring them into multiplayer. Because the monster can only be poisoned one at a time, it makes the DPS of poison split between all the people that are using poison as an ailment. This would be fine if the extra poison also meant an equally larger amount of poisons happening in the hunt, but status thresholds get harder to reach every time you trigger one to activate, or at least until you reach the cap, and then they plateau at the monster's maximum status resistance. What this means is that the extra poison doesn't go as far as the original. You're getting less activations of poison from the extra poison coming from the second person's weapon. And because the DPS of poison is split by everyone that is using poison in the fight, it's going to lower the overall DPS of poison per weapon. In short, you don't want everyone using the same status in multiplayer. So if everyone else has a poison weapon, it's going to be best to swap to something different. And in that case, I recommend looking at the tables that I showed off earlier that focus on elemental weapons. Finally, I want to take this last spot to remind people that your mileage will vary. What weapons are best will depend on what charms and what augments you have available. This is a guide for what I'd call the realistic best case in terms of augments and charms. So using this as a baseline is great, but you've got to fine tweak it to fit the stuff that you've actually got. Speaking of that, would people be interested in a how to optimize armor sets video to show off the process of how to take what you have and fine tune it to be the best it can be? I'd appreciate your input in the comments. And that's it. If you're interested in more Lance stuff, please consider subscribing. If you liked this video, then please like the video. But most importantly, I want to thank you for watching. See you next time.